Hi everybody, so in this video we make our very first steps with pandas, and when we work with data we first have to import the data into our Python environment and then make a very first inspection. So typically when we work with new data we do not really know how the data looks like, and therefore we have to get a very first impression, and after that then we can determine further steps like that we need additional data, or we need to clean the data, or handle missing values, or rearrange the data. But when we work with pandas, we first have to import pandas, so it's not by default imported to our Python environment. And we import pandas as PD, so that's by convention here. And in this video and the next videos, we work heavily with the Titanic dataset, where we get many information about each passenger. So for example, age, or whether the passenger has survived or not. And in our folder, we already have the CSV file. So CSV stands for comma separated value, the Titanic CSV file that we have to import here in our Python environment. And there's the pandas method read CSV, where we can import CSV files, and we already get a kind of tabular organization of our data. So let's have here the CSV method, and then in brackets we have to pass the file name, so it's titanic.csv, and we need this in quotation marks. And let's run the cell here. And this already looks quite good. So we have here the Titanic data set, where we have rows here, and each row stands for one passenger, and we have here 9 columns. And each column is actually a characteristic of the passenger. So for example, passenger 1 has not survived the disaster, so 0 stands for not survived and 1 stands for survived. And we have the passenger class, so we have 3 passenger classes. And then we have the sex or gender of the passengers. In this example it's a male. Then we have the age here. And SIP-SP stands for the amount of siblings or spouses of the passenger on board, and PARCH stands for the amount of children or parents of the passenger aboard. And fare is actually the ticket price and the passenger paid for the trip. Then we have here the port of embarkation. So for example, S stands for Southampton. And last but not least, here we have the deck where the cabin of the passenger was located. So for example, deck C or E. Alright, so this looks pretty good, and I think we are already happy with the importing of the data. So if we press here Shift Tab, we can see that the method read CSV has many options here. And this is very helpful when we have messy data, to clean the data directly when we import it, but it's not necessary here. So then we can save our data set and assign a variable. So let's say we have Titanic. So now we have saved our data set into our Jupyter notebook. And as with all variables, we can just print Titanic here. Now we can have a deeper look here. So we are starting with the first passenger at index position 0. And we end up with actually 891 rows. So each row stands for one passenger, and 9 columns. And each column stands for a characteristic of the passenger. And we can also see here that by default Python prints out the first 30 rows and the last 30 rows. So when we have a very large data set with let's say 10,000 rows, it definitely does not make sense to print out all rows. So that's by default here we have 60 rows. However, we can change this default setting with pd.options.display.max rows. So here it is, and here we can change. So by default it's 60, 2 times 30, and by default we can change this to, for example, 100. So then we should see here the first 50 rows and the last 50 rows. Let's check here. And here we can see, alright, so we have the first 50 rows and the last 50 rows. And when we are not working in Jupyter, when we want to print a data, so we have to use the print function here. And when we use the print function, you can see here that the data is not really formatted. So the graphical rendering of Jupyter Notebook here is much better. And if you want to print a data set or data frame here in Jupyter Notebook, I would always use it without the print function. So here the graphical rendering is quite pretty here. Alright, so now we are finished with this video, and in the next video we continue our first inspection. So hope to see you there. Bye.